From the journal, Questions of Philosophy, 1954, number 3, pages 46-61. Science and the Development of the Productive Forces. Euclid. SGSTRUMILIN. What is science? The content of the multifaceted concept of science does not fit into two tight definitions. They say, for example, and even write in encyclopedias, that science is a body of knowledge about real life. Such a concise definition is not entirely true, for it identifies science with its fruits. Science really gives us knowledge, just as iron is smelted in the metallurgical process, but it would be ridiculous to say that metallurgy is iron produced from metallurgical furnaces. Science is both the process of developing knowledge and the totality of knowledge that has been tested by practice, representing objective truth. If you ask yourself, from what, or the totality of knowledge is developed, you will have to admit that the material for science is the total experience of mankind throughout its history, experience both in the field of forms of consciousness, in actively translating the reflection of the objective world into a logically structured system of judgments and inferences, and in the field of people's work practices, in which these judgments and conclusions either receive confirmation and recognition or are discarded as waste slag. Public practice, however, serves, for scientific theory, not only as a stumbling block upon which its suitability to fulfill its purpose is tested. The very purpose of scientific theories is usually determined by the very real needs of social practice. The needs of cattle breeding stimulated the emergence of arithmetic, agriculture and construction led to the creation of geometry, the development of commercial navigation caused the emergence of stellar astronomy. Responding in its ramifications to such specific requests of various branches of production, science as a whole serves the most important need of the national economy, the need for the development of productive forces. It would be a profound error to regard scientific thought as the primary source of technological progress and the consistent growth of man's productive forces. In the historical change of causes and effects, science did not determine the ways of the economic process, but on the contrary, the latter not only set forth the next tasks for it, but also created the material prerequisites for their successful resolution. However, the historical process is an unbroken chain in which causes and effects are constantly changing places, and yesterday's effects become the cause in the next link of the same chain. We can say that people of true science always act as pioneers of new ways of developing technology. They always chose in their quest for impassable paths and unprosed paths. Remaining the vanguard of scientific thought, they could not break away from practice with impunity. The scintillations of science, which ran far ahead, sometimes faded prematurely in the smoky fires of the obscurantists. But even more often the new paths they traversed were overgrown with weeds of oblivion until they found themselves, already in the new conditions, on the high road of economic development. Historical experience convinces us that even the most fruitful scientific ideas and technical discoveries are permanently doomed to infertility, staying as if in a state of anabiosis, if for their broad perception, recognition and development, the material and social prerequisites have not ripened yet. It is known, for example, that the brilliant discovery by Copernicus of the rotation of the Earth around the Sun for centuries was rejected by the whole Christian world of the Middle Ages as a God-forgiving heresy. But it is possible to recall other examples. In Tsar Russia, the world's first continuous steam machine was created by the outstanding mechanic Nugget-Tupal Zaunov in 1765, that is, 20 years earlier than in industrial England, and the first lathe with the support of Andrei Nartov was completed no later than 1729, 68 years earlier than in England. However, under conditions of servile serfdom, such machines were left without any use, while in England in the 18th century, the same machines, newly designed by the celebrated inventors James Watt and Henry Maudslay, completed the Industrial Revolution. The practical significance of the achievements of science is ultimately determined not so much by their depth and originality as by the level of development of the productive forces and the nature of the economic basis. In ancient society, for example, the discovery of the driving force by the Greek scientist Geron in the 120 years before our era did not receive any recognition. The free labor of slaves eliminated the need for steam engines, which presuppose mass commodity production and the material interest of the worker in the products of his labor. The learned world has ignored the engine of Heron for long 16 centuries, as not worth the attention of the fun. And only in the XV century, when feudalism began to decay and the development of capitalism began, the brilliant Italian Leonardo da Vinci again set himself the task of creating a steam engine. But his efforts were unsuccessful. In 1630 the English scientist Ramsay, and then in 1690 the French physicist Papin proposed new variants of steam engines on the backward base of the Craft Organization of Craft and Single Manufactories. These inventions did not attract public attention. Only in the X8th century in industrial England, the development of large-scale manufactory production gave rise to an urgent need for powerful mechanical engines. Blacksmith Newcomen and glazier Codeleye built in 1711 their first steam engine, suitable only for lifting water from mines. The self-taught mechanic James Watt has been working hard to improve it from 1769 to 1785. Another mechanic, Robert Fulton, applies it on the first steamship in 1807. Another worker, former fireman George Stephenson, uses it on the first locomotive in 1825. So brilliant scientific idea of Heron found the ground for its realization only 19 centuries after its inception, already at the dawn of the epoch of capitalism. From the above example it is evident that sometimes the scientific initiative of scientists for many centuries outstrips the real need for it in society, and in this case, its potential significance can only be guessed. But even in conditions of a mature economic need, scientific thought reveals all its power only in production practice. And then, as already a collective product of science, technology and labor, scientific thought, embodied, say, in a steam engine, becomes one of the most powerful factors of production. And at the same time, the science itself, which made it possible to master the energy of steam, acts as a driving factor in history, which, opening a new era in steam power mechanical production, thus led to a tremendous upsurge in the world capitalist economy, and then a new, unprecedented blossoming of science. Some of the narrow-minded critics dismiss such a high assessment of science as an idealistic heresy, just as a well-known idealistic aphorism is rejected: ideas rule the world. But these critics are bad Marxists if they forget that the theory becomes a material force once it takes possession of the mass. In addition, science, as already noted, is not only the sum of knowledge, but also the process of extracting knowledge and researching the objective laws of nature and society. You cannot simply identify science with some or other of its ideological products. Among them, of course, can be called those bare scientific ideas that are still roaming in the minds of scientists. But this is still unfinished products of scientific work or semi-finished product, obtained only in the initial stage of the cognitive process, called science. In its further stages, the fruits of science already appear in the embodied form of manuscripts, books, geographic maps, star catalogs and geological boreholes, chemical analyses and bacteriological cultures, botanical herbariums and zoological collections, soil sections and archaeological excavations, architectural models of buildings and mechanical models of machines, engineering projects and economic calculations of their effectiveness, comprehensive materials of statistical censuses and all-embracing long-term plans of the people's economy, governmental development. However, modern advanced science does not limit its tasks to such a mere reification of theoretical achievements. It requires practical implementation of them in the surrounding reality, in every way promotes this implementation. And from this broader point of view, The fruits of science to a large extent should be recognized, for example, not only those or other physical theories, but also their wonderful incarnations, like movies and fluorescent daylight, radio receivers and televisions. The fruits of production and science are all our machines and implements, blast furnaces and mines, factories and plants that facilitate our work in social production. Historical roots of science. As you know, the beginnings of science arose much earlier than the first masters and doctors of science appeared in the lush medieval robes and outlandish headdresses, which are still preserved here and there in the bourgeois temples of science. When you see these colorful, cock-like plumage, traditional robes of science priests on some modern scientists, you cannot help recalling the equally bizarre priestly robes of shamans when they perform their professional functions. Apparently, the priests of all the cults first sought to impress the layman's imagination in their appearance, collecting tribute from the simple-hearted flock supposedly as a sacrifice to the gods. They deceived not only this flock, but also the gods themselves, using sacrifices to the gods for themselves. It was not for nothing that the people rudely, but aptly called them priests for the main occupation, from the word guzzle. However, one deceit will not last long. The priests were asked for help in their illnesses and everyday needs. But in order to successfully heal diseases, it is not enough to simulate communication with the gods in a devilish dance at the patient's bedside. To predict the future, not enough guesswork on the coffee grounds. That is why shamans of all times and ranks, whose main profession was the exploitation of the richest minds of human ignorance, monopolized in their narrow caste all the rudiments of scientific knowledge available to them. Already the oldest healers and witches, as it is clear from the names themselves, derived from the words know and know, traded not only with magic and conspiracies, but also medicinal herbs, folk medicine. For a long time they used scientific achievements for their shamanistic purposes, strictly classifying them in their narrow circle, professional priests of various cults. It was precisely in this environment that the now completely forgotten series of especially mysterious, occult sciences of the East, which, in a new attraction to mysticism, does not mind to revive the sunset thought of the bourgeois West, has its beginning. Over time, however, it became increasingly difficult to keep genuine science in a closed circle of the theologians of theology. Without wide application, it could not develop, and developing, inevitably lost its secrecy and, escaping from the hands of the theologians, became more secular, not dependent on the Church. Already in the Middle Ages it was also discovered that true science does not reconcile with the dogmas of theology, completely rejecting all its mysteries and sacraments. From monastic cells, science moved to universities. True, this medieval university science is not far away. Astronomy has not yet completely hatched from astrology. Copernicus, as is known, combined astronomy with the duties of a Catholic priest, and Kepler, who formulated the laws of planetary motion, earned his living by astrological horoscopes. Thus, both of them, by virtue of the conditions of their era, supported and practiced those superstitions with which they fought in theory. Chemical sciences have not yet risen above the level of alchemy, beating over illusory problems about the life elixir and philosophical stone, capable of turning everything into pure gold. What was more in such searches, conscious deception or naive errors, is now difficult to say. But science has already become the arena of an open struggle of truth with delusions. This competition continues to this day in the form of the most acute struggle of materialism against idealism and mysticism. The liberation of science from internal contradictions and the introduction of falsehood takes time and labor. Science still hung in abstractions, and its production effects at this stage of development were still negligible. Only in bourgeois society, with the introduction of machines, when, as Marx put it, the very process of production turns into a technological application of science, science has become an indispensable factor in production. But the science in the person of engineers, inventors and professors of bourgeois society, where everything is sold, can still be bought, patented and appropriated, thus turning both it and the means of production into monopoly ownership of the bourgeoisie and the instrument of exploitation of labor. It is clear that in this society the priests of science, making their goods at the request of the bourgeoisie, dissect and submit their science with such a philosophical seasoning of apologetic lies and deception, which is quite sufficient for class use of it against the working people. Science-like lies only cover up and embellish modern processes of exploitation of labor. The real basis for the very possibility of capitalist exploitation is, as we know, the monopoly of the property of the bourgeoisie over the means of production in general. Since the process of production turns into a technological application of science, the monopoly of the property of the bourgeoisie extends to a factor such as science. The tools of labor in this process are separated by capital from labor and are opposed to it as instruments of exploitation. But the same, according to Marx, occurs with science in capitalist industry, which separates science, as an independent production potency, from labor and makes it serve capital. Sach TX 7, p. 398. Thus, considering the content of science for the entire period of its development in an antagonistic society, we see in it a constant symbiosis of the opposing principles of truth and error with a fair dose of direct deception and self-serving lies. But all the modifications of lies and deceit, from naive shamanism to the sophisticated apologetics of capitalism, by their very nature are alien to science. They are brought into science only in the mercenary interests of the rule of the privileged minority over the majority of mankind. And with the abolition of the exploiting classes, they are completely expelled from science. And instruments of labor in science in socialist society are already becoming the common property of all working people and serve the whole of society. Science is being introduced into production by the clerks of the bourgeoisie, not by other people's hands, but by the united efforts of the working people themselves, their intelligentsia, builders and designers, engineers and agronomists. Here all the working people, at the machine tools and behind the tractors, become the same working intelligentsia, confidently advancing along a path of cultural and technical development. The results that this cultural revolution promises to us is incalculable. However, it would be appropriate to recall this fact. At the very beginning of the first 5-year plan, our planners determined that the productivity of labor, and at the same time, the piecework earnings of ordinary workers at the machine tool that graduated from the 7-year period, all other things being equal and the same tools of labor, that is, exclusively at the expense of their better utilization, 67% compared to workers of the same age and length of service, but without any education. Elementary calculation showed that every billion rubles spent on school education in the USSR increases the amount of people's income of the country due to this increase in productivity by about 6 billion rubles. This is the effect even of school science, which is being introduced into the working environment. Without an extended reproduction of knowledge in this environment, it is impossible to successfully introduce into the production all new and immeasurably more productive achievements of creative science and technology, down to an electronic bulb and modern automatic and telemechanic devices that exclude ignorance with them. In the fertilization of labor by science, in all its technological applications, we open the possibility of raising the productive power of labor not only by tens of %, but also by tens of times. Even in an antagonistic society, one can only hinder the growth of science, prevent its spread among the masses, but it is impossible to stop its spontaneous movement forward. The practice of the general production process in its development imperatively requires and itself promotes the growth of the corresponding branches of knowledge. And the process of scientific knowledge passes on its historical path the same stages of development as all other major branches of social labor have gone through. Nowadays, monopoly capital, mobilizing modern bourgeois science, armed it with its equipment in its institutes and factory laboratories, that we can already talk about the factory production of scientific discoveries and inventions, from penicillin to atomic bombs. The most highly organized and technically equipped Soviet science is quite differently connected with the social production of material goods. Its links with production are not tied to the private economic interests of individual monopolies. Here, not only individual, so-called applied disciplines, but the whole system of sciences as a whole is called upon to serve the building of communism in the USSR. The plans for research work of the academies of sciences of the USSR are organically linked with the problems of the socialist economy. For the preparation of regular business events, the Academy of Sciences annually organizes scientific expeditions for the purpose of comprehensive study and use of the productive forces and natural resources of our country. Soviet scientists take a lively part in field research and geological exploration, organize trial enrichment of poor ores and smelting metals from them under semi-production conditions, and carry out scientific expertise of the feasibility and cost-effectiveness of the largest construction projects being designed in the country. Not to mention the fact that scientific, engineering and engineering work occupies the leading place in existing industrial enterprises. From the instrument of deception and exploitation of labor, science under socialism has become an instrument for the liberation of the masses from exploitation and at the same time becomes an increasingly valuable factor in social production and an inexhaustible source of growth in the productive power of labor. Science and superstructure. The classics of Marxism-Leninism quite clearly distinguish, within the framework of each social formation, such basic elements as 1. The productive forces of society, 2. The production relations corresponding to them, representing the economic basis, the real basis, of each formation, and 3. The legal and political superstructure. According to Marx, certain ideological forms of public consciousness correspond to the basis, legal, political, religious, artistic and philosophical. According to Stalin, the superstructure is the political, legal, religious, artistic, philosophical views of society and the corresponding political, legal and other institutions. Marxism and Linguistics, p. 5. None of these definitions of the superstructure mentions science as a whole. Naturally, the question arises, is it possible only to associate all of science with superstructures by its contiguity with philosophical views? There are important practical consequences associated with this or that decision of this issue. It is known in fact that the superstructure appears after the basis, actively promotes it to consolidate and finish the old basis and disappears with the elimination of its basis. Are these, however, signs and fates of science? There is no doubt that, for example, under the rule of the bourgeoisie, all its defensive institutions as combat superstructures over the base serve only its class interests and share the destiny of this class. But the views of a society divided into antagonistic classes are a motley and contradictory conglomerate. Krupin, Marx, Rybushinsky, and Lenin were contemporaries. But their views were diametrically opposed. Obviously, when speaking about the views of class society, one should keep in mind the views prevailing in it, that is, the ideology of the class in power. In the conditions of the class struggle, the ideology of the obsolete classes also leaves its imprint on scientific thinking. There can be no doubt that such an elementary truth as, 2 to 4, if only it touched someone's class interests, would become the subject of scientific discussions in political struggle and class society. Elemental vigilance obliges us to reveal the manifestations of class influence in any of the sciences in bourgeois society, mercilessly exposing and dismissing all elements of pseudo-scientific, reactionary falsity. But the presence of such ideological elements in science and the conditions of the domination of the obsolete classes does not yet give us the right to treat this science as a whole only as a protective ideological superstructure over the exploitative basis. Recognizing the science of only one of the ideological superstructures over the economic basis of a changing formation, we would have to draw all the conclusions from the fact that the superstructure does not live long, that it is liquidated and disappears with the elimination of this basis. Thus, feudal society should have swept aside the ancient science, the bourgeoisie, to strike out feudal science, and we, in the USSR, should have already abolished all the achievements of science from Newton and Lomonosov to our days. And yet, as you know, this did not happen. In the Soviet school until now, teaching and developing, not only the scientific achievements of scientists such as Einstein, Mendeleev and Darwin, but, turning to the distant past, extract and therefrom such unfading scientific values as the law of conservation of Lomonosov's substance, 1756, the law of universal gravitation of Newton, X7th century, the immortal, according to Engels, the creation of Copernicus about the rotation of the Earth around the Sun, 1512, and many others, right up to the logic of Aristotle and the geometry of Euclid. Antiquity, 3rd century BC, already over 2 tons millennia, and all the changes in class social formations have entered the golden fund of science, the mastery of which is included in the mandatory minimum of all schoolchildren of the USSR. F. Engels as early as 1872 foresaw the possibility, at a sufficiently high level of the productive power of labor and its reasonable separation, to provide everyone with enough leisure time so that from a historically inherited culture, science, art, forms of community, etc., and not only perceive, but also transform it from the monopoly of the ruling class into the common good of the whole society and contribute to its further development. Such. It is indisputable, however, that true art, like true science, cannot be tied to just one social formation. Remember at least how many different formations have survived in their time immortal creations of Homer. Defending the ideals of progressive mankind, the communists are ready in the struggle for them to use all ideological and material resources, including the power of true science and the attractiveness of genuine art. In order to satisfy the high demands of the new society, science and art under socialism must be free from all sectarian exclusiveness, which hinders the introduction of all advanced humanity to them. In our country, we are justly branded not only by people who are capable of worshipping foreign authorities of science and culture, but also those who ignore actual achievements, for such an empty conceit only reduces our speed of progress toward communism. It is impossible not to condemn, Michael Youn said recently on this occasion, those comrades who, on the pretext of combating adultery before foreigners, ignored foreign experience, ceased to be interested in it, studied it, used what is useful to us. The Pravda newspaper of October 25, 1953. In a recent discussion on the subject of science, it was correctly noted that the task of the working class that overthrew capitalism was not to indiscriminately take over or discard the science inherited from capitalism. The task was to separate the truly scientific content from the unscientific ideological distortions and falsifications of scientific knowledge. And to address such issues requires a specific approach to the content of each science separately. In any of them there may be elements of delusion and even more often conscious falsification of scientific truths in the interests of servicing the foundations of a dying social order. At the same time, in every science, it is necessary to distinguish such truly scientific elements that arm us with knowledge of the laws of nature and society. Thus, first of all, it is necessary to distinguish genuine science from pseudoscience, from those world outlook pendants and inclusions of pseudoscience, which the mainstream parasitic classes always attracted to arming with the greater zeal, the closer their history led to inevitable death. These pseudo-scientific elements of apologetic lies are inherent in various branches of science in the countries of capitalism in very different proportions. In the sciences of nature they are fewer, in social sciences there is much more, but in such a specifically world outlook area as bourgeois philosophy, sociology, jurisprudence, aesthetics, they dominate almost completely.